All right. Hello, you guys. Brief introduction. So, welcome to the Geek Group. This is the Executive Book Club, we call it, and it's on Sunday nights. And um, my name is Max Rock. A brief introduction this book club is currently with the Geek Group members in the Geek Group Plus or above subscription. I am a real estate investor and an educator with a background in engineering and business. If you want to find out more about the Geek Group, then find us at multifamilygeeks.com. A couple other things, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. That's greatly appreciated. And don't forget to click the bell to be notified when new videos come out. So with that said, I'm going to review for you Lean Startup, actually The Lean Startup by Eric Ries. And I had to look up how to say his last name. It's spelled R-E or R-I-E-S, and it's pronounced Rise. So I went straight into the book rating. And out of 3 that I go from either must read, good read, or don't read, I'm labeling this one a must read. I think a lot of us are involved in entrepreneurial/startup ventures, and that's really what this book is targeted at. So I said, why? It explains the difference between managing an ongoing business and managing a startup business, right? So with that said, about the author, Eric Ries, other books that he's written, The Startup Way and The Leader's Guide. And he's developed some successful startup businesses, and that's how he came to understand the difference between startup management versus ongoing management. All right, a quick review of the table of contents. So I was going to say read from my Audible, but I actually typed in a little summary here. There's 3 parts to the book. 1 is vision, 2 is steer, and 3 is accelerate. So under vision, he's got start, define, learn, experiment. Then under the steer, part 2, leap, test, measure, and pivot or persevere. And then for part 3, accelerate, batch, grow, adapt, innovate, and then epilogue and join the movement. So that said, let's see if I can scroll down a little bit. Startup management versus ongoing management. Here's the kind of summary of how he sums up the difference between these two. The assumptions that we make in a startup are very dangerous. So, and this is different from an ongoing business. An ongoing business has a product, a customer base, an understanding of what product they have and what customers are paying for. The startup doesn't. We think we do in a startup, and that's the assumptions we make. And it's very dangerous. And he claims this is why most of us don't make it out of our startup mode. So he claims the responsibility to talk to customers in a startup management company becomes, in a startup management effort, becomes primary. So you're trying to talk to customers, find out what's happening, and then make a lot of changes based on tests, and you're doing everything simultaneously. So he gives the feedback loop. He calls it build, measure, and learn. And he goes into this idea of learning, right? So if we go into a new venture and we try something new and it's a startup business and we fail, what we say is, well, we learned a lot of things, right? But he wants to distinguish the difference between that kind of learning and the real-time process of learning what you need to learn to make adjustments and fix the business and survive and thrive. So what he says is, well, the process, the feedback loop is build, measure, learn. We're actually trying to reverse that feedback process loop. And we're trying to, number 1, what do we need to learn? Therefore, what do we need to measure? And therefore, what do we need to build? And the idea that we have a product and we map it out in a product venture with a business plan, like sort of the traditional model says, is completely false. It says all that is a huge waste of time because probably most of it is wrong, and we won't know till we get into the thick of it. So on that basis, there's this idea of, he talks about leaps of faith within a startup business, assumptions that need to be tested. Number 1, there's a value leap of faith. And number 2, there's a growth leap of faith. Value is our assumption on what is the value that customers get in exchange for their money. And then number 2, growth. How will new customers find the product? Will the first customers refer others? These two assumptions are what we're driving at in terms of tests to see what is really happening and what is the truth of the product. So don't find the average customer. Find the early adopters, as they are eager to talk to you about their experiences. So in every startup business, there's this idea of who are the average customers out there? And maybe that's who they decide to market to. He says, don't bother. Find the early adopters. These are sort of those, that small category of a little bit odd customers. They like to adopt new things. They like to find out about new products. And they're totally willing to tell you how to change it. If you go ask them, what do you like or not like, they'll not only tell you, but they'll make a lot of suggestions and are eager to be involved in the process of changing what needs to be changed. So then he talks about the MVP, the minimum value proposition. This is the idea that while you may have a product in your mind and these two assumptions about value and growth, these leaps of faith, if you can boil the product down into its simplest form, now you can go out and test that. And he says it's like selling the prototype. Most entrepreneurs or startup business ventures don't like this idea because they feel like they're going to the customer with a half of a product. He tells you that's exactly what you need to do. In fact, you need to go to the customer with a quarter of the product or 10% of what you thought the original product was. What's the main idea? What's the main point? What does that prototype look like if you had to build the first one off the shelf? There's a lot of bells and whistles you're going to leave on the table. And that's exactly what you should do. So he talks about this minimum value proposition, and he talks about Zappos. When the founder of Zappos was starting, he went to shoe stores and he said, hey, I want to take some photos of your shoes. And in exchange, I'm going to put them online. In exchange, if I sell any of those shoes, I'm going to come back to you and pay full price for those shoes, buy them straight from you. And what he was doing was literally testing the minimum value proposition. What would it take to get a customer to buy shoes? Is there any customers to buy shoes online? What do they need to see to buy shoes? Will they pay money? Does he have the portal ready for them to drop money on the product? All of these things that need to be tested before the entire theory of the idea of an online shoe store was even tested yet. So he's able to break the product down into a minimum value proposition, then go out and test that right away. He's literally selling the prototype, if that kind of makes sense with the way they're describing that. So then he talks about traditional startup businesses. And if you watch the Shark Tank, you'll hear this all the time. They'll say, what's the burn rate, right? The burn rate is the amount of cash in the bank divided by how much money is being spent each month, right? So let's take an easy example. $1 million is sitting in the bank. We're spending $100,000 a month. We've got 10 months before we're out of cash and this entire venture is over. So he doesn't want you to use the burn rate. He wants you to use the number of pivots as the length of the new business life. So let's say we're running experiments with this minimum value proposition, and we find out that the customer doesn't like at all what we're offering, and in fact suggests an entirely different value proposition for us. The question now becomes, do we pivot or do we persevere with what we originally decided, right? And he's got a whole different number of dynamics around this, and it kind of depends on the product and situation. This becomes a little bit more of a challenging decision, and this is where the actual work of the startup comes down to. So a startup is a testing organization to move from assumptions to truths as quickly as possible. Essentially redefining what a startup is. It's a testing organization. That's all it is. And so it's based around this idea of I'm going to ask the customer what's happening, find out the truth, and then make a decision on pivots and or perseveres. Okay, so pivots and the visionary. So every business, if you think of Traction by Gino Wickman, where he's talking about the 5 positions in a company, you've got your visionary, your integrator, and then the head of marketing, the head of ops, and the head of finance. The visionary is the one mapping out, we're going to do this big thing. Here's what it looks like. And the entire organization is trying to follow that. The visionary may have some personal problems with this idea of pivot versus persevere because they're facing certain emotional challenges. The emotional challenges are they're terrified that the vision is wrong, right? Because now you're the visionary. That might make me look bad. If I'm saying hey, here's the vision and it's not working, I have to actually go and change that. But worse, he said, is the visionary that feels terrified that the original vision he or she laid out is not fully understood and represented. So they insist on persevering because they're like, no, you're not presenting what I originally said, so you're not giving the original vision a fair chance. He says both of those are misleads and potentially devastating for the startup company. And the visionary needs to be in on this idea that changing is part, a potential pivot is part of what's going on. And the number of pivots that the company has is the life of the new startup. So he's got this whole idea of innovation accounting, where you're validating learning fast, accurately, and with brutal honesty, where you're testing assumptions, being specific about assumptions, and testing multiple assumptions at one time. In other words, we're not just doing one thing and waiting for the feedback and then making changes. We're finding a way to incorporate as many of these ideas of as many people into the product simultaneously and working very hard to measure what the results mean in terms of those variables. And then minimum viable products used to judge and fewer features. That's back to your MVP, your minimum value proposition. You're trying to really push on that. And even he says, go against your better judgment, where it looks like you've stripped down the product too much, strip it down all the way. And that's the one we test. And then, so here's the summary. Startup management is completely different from ongoing management. So be deliberate about the differences in your effort. And in most cases, ongoing, multifold, quick cycle experiments must be made and implemented in terms of a pivot or persevere. That's the real focus of the startup venture. All right, so that's my review of The Lean Startup by Eric Ries, and it's a must read. I think if you're in any kind of entrepreneurial venture, which almost all of us are one way or another, this is a great read and a great book to have as you start to go through some of your experiences with your own startups.